To recap the last slide, which was the last slide in part one, I had just introduced the psychological theories of crime, and these theories of crime are similar to biological theories of crime, but these theories look how individual factors can be used to explain criminal behavior. The researchers that use psychological theories of crime explain criminal behavior by individual factors such as deficiencies in early childhood socialization or experiences that led to gaps in their cognitive development. It's such gaps that these theorists suggest can explain why people may commit crime. Psychological theories have also investigated how behaviors like aggression, violence, impulsivity, and so on are learned behaviors. So we have Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is not a criminologist, but his psychoanalytic theory is used to understand criminal behavior. And it was this work on the unconscious mind that is often used to help explain criminality from a psychological perspective. So he argued that an individual's personality is based on three parts, which is the ID, the ego, and the superego. So the ID refers to one's instinctual wants and desires and is present at birth, while the ego is a rational thinker of one's personality. And third, the superego refers to the ability to create balance between the ID and the ego. Now, while the ID is present at birth and the ego evolves as part of one's development, the superego is what we call the voice of reason. Now, how can Freud's concepts of the ID, ego, and superego be used to understand criminal behavior, you may be asking, because this is coming from a psychological perspective. Well, in some respects, the ID can be thought of as a part of the personality that drives impulsive behavior, and we'll discuss impulsive behavior a little bit later, possibly in part 3. So given that many crimes are committed in the heat of the moment or acts of opportunity, which we'll also discuss later on, they would be considered to be driven by what he called the ID. While the ego is a side of the personality that would encourage the law-abiding behavior, with the superego being the calculating rational thinker, that rational choice that we discussed earlier, which would lead one to make engaged decisions about whether to commit a crime or not. Then we have cognitive development theory, which states that offenders have failed to develop the capacity to make any type of moral judgment. And now we also have Jean Piaget. Jean Piaget also is not a criminologist, but his work identified 4 stages in the cognitive development of children. Now we're going to discuss Piaget because he later inspired Lawrence Kohlberg to apply these ideas in the framework of criminology. So, like I was saying, Piaget's work identified 4 stages in cognitive development, and it was first, the sensory motor stage refers to the first 2 years of life, and it's during this stage that children learn about the world through different sensory explorations. The second stage is the pre-operational stage, which lasts from age 2 to age 7, and it's during this stage that children develop their language communication skills. They also build their imagination and play skills. It's not until the third stage, the concrete operational stage, that children begin to develop their logical skills. They begin to understand how they relate to a larger community, such as a group of friends. They also begin to feel empathy for others. The concrete operational stage begins around age 7 and lasts until age 11. And then lastly, the fourth stage is the formal operational stage, which begins at age 12 and continues through adulthood. During the fourth stage, a child may increase their logic development and begin to explore deductive reasoning skills. They also begin to diversify their thought and identify multiple solutions to a problem. So think of these 4 stages as you grew up, and think of these different age periods throughout your life, and how you started engaging in these different things, like language communication at age 2 or 3. And how between 7 and 11 you started to develop logical skills, etc. So, like I was saying, Piaget is not a criminologist. However, Kohlberg, applied Piaget's theory and the theory of moral development into 6 stages of development that he grouped into 3 levels. And these levels were the pre-conventional stage, in which children develop obedience and are first introduced to the notion of punishment. They also begin to determine their own self-interest, and it's at this level that children may evaluate how they can actually avoid punishment. Level 2 is the conventional level. Here you identify with the social norms of law-abiding behavior, and as a result avoid law-violating behaviors. While level 3 is the post-conventional level, which is when young adults begin to consider their worldview in light of their own moral compass. So Kohlberg and the other researchers that he was working with found that youth who engaged in violent behaviors had significantly lower levels of moral development, as illustrated by these 3 levels compared with youth who were not involved in acts of violence. So he put these 3 levels adapted from Piaget's earlier 4 different categories to the test. Now let's continue to biosocial theories. So notice the word biosocial, right? Bio, the root word like biological, and social, like sociological. So these are mixing, right? The bio and the sociological theories. So these theories, they work to investigate how biological traits can contribute to crime, and in many cases, how these factors interact with social environments to produce criminal behaviors. So again, it's the social environments from the word biosocial and the biological traits being fused together. An example of this would be, different biosocial explanations of crime that have focused on variants in brain chemistry and how that can have an impact on actual criminal behavior. Another example would be how research has linked higher levels of testosterone with aggression and antisocial behaviors, while antisocial individuals are also more likely to possess lower levels of serotonin. Both aggression and antisocial behavior are correlates of criminal behavior, meaning that they're correlates means that they are associated with, but they don't necessarily cause it. All right. At the end of this, of part 3, I will discuss the difference between causation and correlation. Biosocial theories of crime have also, research stemming from this has also, recorded observations of the relationship between the environment and crime, right? And there's one well-known study of these variables in the realm of lead poisoning, right? During the 1920s, the use of lead paint increased in homes. From the 1940s to the 70s, gasoline also contained high levels of lead. So we can't conclude that spikes in violent crime during the 30s and from the 1950s to 80s were a result of lead exposure, but there is a corresponding pattern. So research has noted that exposure to lead, particularly for young children, can increase the risk of learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So for example, like given what we know about lead exposure, will we see increased harm to a community that is already challenged by poverty and crime in future decades if they are exposed to lead? Are they more vulnerable than a community that's also exposed to lead, but that it does not exhibit poverty and crime? So we're going to now discuss sociological theories. And these theories are macro-level theories. Remember, in the first part of this presentation, we made the difference between the micro and the macro levels, micro and macro theories of criminology. And again, these macro-level theories look at the larger social structures that can explain criminal behavior, like the environment, society, the neighborhood, etc. So the first one that we have is social disorganization theory, which looks at how neighborhood environments contribute to criminal behavior. And using the city of Chicago as their test, researchers Park and Burgess suggested that as cities grow and prosper, residents are either forced out of the business zones or choose to exit in an effort to escape the things that come with city life. And because of this, there's deterioration of the inner city communities because people see it as a transition neighborhood. They don't want to stay there for the long run. So their work provided the foundation for Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay's discussion of social disorganization as an explanation for criminal behavior. The communities around these factories in the inner city were often the most affordable places to live and were often dominated by workers and those new to the area and in search of employment. So, being that nobody cares specifically about that specific neighborhood, and individuals are using it as a transition neighborhood, there is possible poverty. There's a big cultural mix from different immigrants. There's physical dilapidation, which means that the neighborhood is falling apart. No one's taking care of it. There's high mobility of residents transitioning, and there may be other social ills like unemployment, drug use, single parent households, and all that may possibly cause criminal behavior. So they may not cause it, but like I said earlier, all these may be correlated with crime, and when combined, there may be a higher correlation. So social disorganization theory is a reflection of how crime is related to socioeconomic status, particularly for those of lower class communities. And unlike other theories before this one of crime that focus on an individual's biological or psychological characteristics to explain offending, this specific theory, social disorganization, was one of the first efforts to look at the effects of social structures of crime. So what happens to a community when it lacks cohesion, when it lacks good jobs, good community, when people take care of their area, when people stay there for a long time and want to invest in the area, when it doesn't have those social ills like drug use and single parent households, etc. Then we have strain theory. This was Robert Merton, right? And Robert Merton's theory of strain was influenced by Durkheim's concept of anomie. Anomie refers to a sense of normlessness that societies experience as a result of a breakdown in social cohesion of society. So when they lack the guidance and structure for appropriate social behaviors. So here, criminal behavior is a consequence of what's called anomie. So Merton, right? According to Merton, people experience strain when the socially approved goals do not mesh with the socially approved means to achieve those goals. So Merton identified 5 different types of categories within this theory, and here they are. They are the conformist, the ritualist, the innovator, the retreatist, and the rebel. And depending on which one you fall in, you will either abide to not commit crimes, or you will commit crimes in order to achieve those desired goals that might not be socially approved, but that you want to achieve anyways. So after Merton, we have Agnew, which came with general strain theory, and it's some more modern applications for strain. So general strain theory looks into individualized psychological sources as correlates of criminal behavior. Agnew highlights 3 potential sources of strain, and they are failure to achieve positive goals, the loss of positive influences, and the arrival of negative influences. In particular, strain-inducing events are most likely to lead to criminal behavior if they, 1, are seen as unjust, 2, are seen as high in magnitude, 3, associated with low social control, and 4, create some pressure or incentive to engage in criminal coping. Now, research on strain theory highlights that some individuals are more likely to engage in criminal and delinquent behaviors than others as a result of their experiences with strain. So, for example, juveniles who experience strain within their relationship with their families, schools, and neighborhoods are more likely to engage in delinquent acts than those who are not. For example, African Americans also experience strain in ways that are unique to their community. So efforts to cope with such strain may lead to increased risk of crime and delinquency. Then we have what's called differential association. This specific theory focuses on the influence that relationships have on crime, in particular the influence of peer relationships on delinquent crime, right? So Edward Sutherland came up with differential association theory, and is influenced by social learning theory. Differential association theory asserts that learned behaviors about crime and delinquency are a result of peer association. So when I commit a crime, it may be because I learned this behavior from my big brother, from a friend I admire, from someone else in my family. And the more a person is exposed to delinquent attitudes and behaviors, the more those attitudes will influence that person. And that's why criminal behavior is learned. Now, recent research has highlighted how demographic factors such as race, ethnicity, and gender can also impact how peer relationships affect delinquent behaviors. But this specific theory has been criticized, and one of the key criticisms involves the temporal order of criminal behavior. So, is it that I learn I'm a non-criminal, and then I start hanging out with criminals and I learn the behavior from those criminals and I engage in criminal behavior? Or is it that I start hanging out with the criminals who engage in criminal behavior because I already am a criminal? So is it that I'm learning, or is it that birds of a feather flock together and I'm going to gravitate to those specific individuals? And then Sutherland came up with 9 principles for differential association, which here they are. Right, and you could pause it and read them. I'm going to continue part 3, beginning with labeling theory. So we're going to stop here for part 2.